Hey folks, welcome back to another edition of My Car Guru. It's time to get some of that insider information and to take a trip down memory lane. Yes, we're going to look back and go through each decade and what were the primary design influences since, well, the decade that I was born in, the 50s, all the way up through today. And I just wish you could respond. Well, you can respond. I just can't hear your response to what you think or thought about those particular design trends that were heavily influencing the way cars looked. Really, the way they were equipped. Not only the little artistic things like hood ornaments and stuff like that, but just the overall design philosophy and how it's changed and how it has been greatly influenced by requirements of the federal government and primarily crashworthiness. You know, when a designer of a vehicle wants it to be able to stand up and get 5 stars from a side impact or a frontal offset impact, they got to make some compromises. And we'll talk about one of the major compromises that have been made. And maybe you like it. Maybe you like the way cars look today. I'm indifferent to it. I mean, some of the manufacturers have done a really good job making, for example, crossovers, SUVs. I'm not going to use the term crossover anymore. That's gone. Everybody refers to them as SUVs. So let's just do that. Even a CRV is an SUV. I still don't like acronyms. But yeah, they've done a good job with front-end designs. Not much you can do from the side except to make, add more metal around the C-pillar to make it look more substantial. And then, what's a C-pillar, Lenny? So the frame around the windshield, that's the A-pillar. The post behind the driver to his left, where the seatbelt connects, that's the B-pillar. Does that make sense? The one behind the rear seat passenger is a C, and then the D would be like on an SUV. A lot of passenger cars don't have a D. There's a trunk back there. But, they've done a great job with taillights. Interesting things are being done. So, you got to differentiate yourself somehow, don't you? It's just curious to me why some people will just fall all over a Toyota RAV4, and others lean towards the CRV, others lean toward the Nissan Rogue, some towards the Hyundai Santa Fe, which is do you remember the Ford Flex? That was a very polarizing vehicle. I would actually tell somebody, I said, well, we don't sell minivans, but we have this really cool vehicle that has 7-passenger seating, and I think you'll really like it. And as we approached it, they would say, you're not talking about that thing, are you? It looks like a hearse. And I said, yeah, but it has nice... No, not interested. Or other people say, oh, that's nice. What's that called? And I'd say, well, that's a Ford Flex. That's an intriguing name as well. And so they would just be all infatuated with it. Made it a lot easier. But we're going to go through those trends. A couple updates here. The car or SUV or truck that's parked in your driveway is worth 6.3% more than it was a year ago. That's kind of a generalization, so don't get your hopes up. Because if you take it to most dealers, they're going to tell you, well, it ain't worth, it's depreciated, all cars depreciate. Really, used cars have appreciated as a whole, 6.3% since last June. Why, Lenny? Well, a number of reasons. Because new car prices have ballooned, and there's, it just kind of has all boats rise, with the rising tide, and the tide has risen. You can blame tariffs. I don't think it's tariffs' fault at this point. I think it's a certain degree of greed of automakers trying to fatten their profit margins. I think it's also too much tech, way too much tech in all these vehicles. But yeah, new car prices are higher. There are fewer off-lease vehicles than normal. So when somebody drives a lease car, let's say they have a 36-month lease, what do they do with it when they're done? They turn it in. Where do they go after that? They go to the auction. And car maker or car dealers like me, we buy them. And so what is happening right now, there's just not as many off-lease things because the pandemic kind of put the halt to vehicle sales in general because of the lack of availability and to leasing. So there's fewer lease vehicles. Fewer vehicles mean higher prices. And then another thing that's driving up cost is just high acquisition costs. When we go to the auto auction, we have to pay enormous fees every time we buy a car. I mean, the fees can be anywhere from $600 to $1,000 just to buy a car, and then you got to get it to the dealership. So you got transportation costs. Then you got to recondition whatever it needs. So that adds to the cost. By the time you put it out there on the lot, you've almost got retail in it, and there's no profit to be made. And you better sell it quickly because over time it's just like a fruit stand. You let it sit out there and it rots. And that's what happens to old used cars. Ford just recently announced that they're stopping the employee pricing. It was very, very successful for us Ford dealers. It was a very good program. We needed that. That was a good shot in the arm. So what are they going to do to replace that? Well, pretty good deal. 0% financing for 48 months. I think it's 1.9 for 60 and, still pretty good rates. But here's another kicker. They're not going to require anything down. 0 down payment. So that's good. And no payments for 90 days. Now that's handy for some people, to get through the summer, maybe get through the beginning of the school year. So that's handy. Don't have to make any payments. Does that cost you extra money? Well, no, not in interest because it's 0 interest. What would a regular loan rate be, Lenny? Probably around 7.9. Maybe the credit unions are dipping down into the 6% range. So 0 is sounding pretty good. If you go in to buy a car, you need to have them, well, if you go in to buy a Ford, I don't know, the other manufacturers will probably respond to this to one degree or another, but have them calculate the payments at 48 months at 0% and 0 down. Now, if you have trade equity, then that's going to reduce the payment even more. If you're upside down, of course, it's going to increase your monthly payment. But try it out at 0 for 48, but don't overstretch because, you got to really pay attention to that budget. So I was going to do some calculations for you, but I think you can do that. Just go to a payment calculator on your computer and you can figure that out. Determine the selling price of the car plus tax and just divide it by 48 months. That's really easy, isn't it? Okay, so a good friend of mine asked me a question. He was just commenting about how design trends have changed over the years. He was wondering why there's so many blacked out vehicles right now, blacked out wheels and grills and windows for that matter. And when did that get started? Well, in fact, it started in the early 2010s, 2012 time frame. It really started with customizers, the tuner culture, and then Mercedes-Benz jumped on it, and then BMW, they're kind of trendsetters, and then Toyota, then Ram and Jeep and Ford. Now they all have their dark editions. Chevrolet has the Midnight Edition, which will be a black grille. There's no chrome trim anywhere on it. It has black wheels. If there are any body side moldings, which there aren't on many vehicles these days, maybe wheel arch moldings, they will be black. Ford calls it the Black Appearance Package. That's pretty straightforward. Toyota calls it Nightshade. Isn't that sweet? Nissan calls it the Midnight Edition. So chrome is dead for now, unless you're old like me. Okay, I'll be back in just 1 minute. Okay, so a lot of my current customers, grew up in the 50s. When I say grew up, I don't mean, came of age in the 50s. What do I mean? They got their driver's license. And, they're such big fans of those 55 Chevys and 57 Fords and you name it, Chrysler 300s. Not the early 50s. The early 50s was kind of an experimentation. Up through the 30s and up through the 40s, from 40 to 45, no American cars were produced because they were producing war material. But in late 45, early 46, they started building cars again. And a lot of them were just like the cars of the 30s. They hadn't innovated at all. But in the early 50s, they decided, okay, we don't need these big pontoon-like fenders anymore. Let's make the front of the car wider. We'll have more space for larger engines, more room to work under the hood. And we don't need these big fenders. We can actually reduce our production cost. They're easier to stamp out of steel if they are flatter. So that's what they decided to do. So through the 50s, they had some innovation, but when the 55 Chevy came out, that was transformative because they came out with a new V8 engine. And Mr. Cole, C-O-L-E, he was basically the father at GM of the small block Chevy V8. And he said, okay, we need some innovative body styles in order to attract attention to this wonderful engine. So the 55 Chevy was remarkable. But the 57 is the one that a lot of people think about because of it has what? What does it have? That's right, tail fins. So key trends in the jet age, that was what they called the 50s, the jet age extravaganza. Tail fins and chrome, which were inspired by aircraft and rockets. There was still kind of a post-World War II aviation fascination. If you look at a lot of the hood ornaments and a lot of the designs, they tried to make the cockpits of cars look like an airplane cockpit, and the outside real swoopy with these sharp edges in the rear, with fins, and then a lot of wing-like features on the vehicles. Even the mirrors were aviation inspired. And then the front ends started taking on features like they were getting ready to shoot missiles out the front end. And that was a big trend. Also, wraparound windshields. Up to this point, windshields were flat. And so wraparound windshields became a design feature. And two-tone paint schemes. That just really wasn't a thing. It was a thing back in the 20s and 30s with higher-end cars like Duesenbergs and Chryslers and Packards and Lincolns and Cadillacs. But you fast forward to the late 50s and you get some really elaborate, beautiful color schemes. The way they broke up the colors, the top would be one color, the middle section would be a different color, and then the bottom section would be the same color as the top. And they had all these different variations. And I just really enjoy seeing cars from the 50s, especially the ones that are well restored. That makes a big difference. And there was an emphasis on luxury. And I think, the color schemes just kind of showed off a little bit of optimism that existed in the late 50s. Of course they had to duck into the bomb shelters because they're worried about missiles and atomic weapons. But when they weren't worried about that, they were enjoying the colorful cars that they had to drive. Let's talk about the 60s. It was pretty much, if you were to summarize it, you would call it muscle and minimalism. So what were the key trends in the 60s? Well, muscle cars, pony cars, Mustang, GTO, Challengers, Camaros, clean lines, flatter bodywork. They weren't as rounded as the 50s. And they didn't look as thick as the cars from the 50s. There was more restrained use of chrome. In the 50s, they loved chrome. Everything was chrome. Hidden headlights first appeared they didn't first appear. There was hidden headlights on a 1920-something Cord. But yeah, hidden headlights came back. Fastback roof lines, they got really flat. And then very driver-focused interiors and gauges. So that was the trend. You think about the 65 Ford Mustang, Pontiac GTO, even the E-Type Jaguars. That's hard for different people to say. The British say Jaguar. I say Jaguar. So who's to say who's right? 1970s. This was the boxy time. Bland, very bumper heavy. Federal regulations, thank you very much, led to bulky 5-mile-per-hour bumpers and sealed beam headlights. The shapes were boxier in the 70s. They had drastically reduced performance due to the emission rules and oil crises, and people just really weren't fired up about Speed, that was the least of their concerns. Although there were, in the 70s, a lot of high-performance cars, but horsepower was available in the early part of the decade, but not so much in the end. There was the rise of compact imports like the Toyota Corolla and different products from Volkswagen. And then what did the Americans do? They tried to respond with amazing creations like the Chevrolet Vega or the Ford Pinto. How about the Gremlin, AMC Gremlin? Bad response. Vinyl roofs were a big deal back in the 70s. Opera windows, Landau roofs, Brome packages. These were all very prevalent. You know, these crushed velour seats, too. I mean, you look in, I remember the Oldsmobile 98. If it had cloth seats, it looked like it belonged in front of a TV somewhere, you know, like something somebody would either take a good nap on or watch, you know, the Ed Sullivan Show. But no, these were in cars, and they didn't hold up real well over time. But these were some of the notable trends of the 70s. Let's look at the 80s. The 80s were, you know, I was really involved in the business heavily in the 80s. I first got into the car business full-time in 1978. So in the 80s, that was that's when I was really cranking it up. And we were trying to really go for volume. We were Chevrolet and Mazda at that time. But the focus on the 80s was aerodynamics, smooth curves, sloped noses, flush glass, plastic body cladding. You know, that was really popular across the bottom of the vehicle. Digital dashboards first emerged in the 80s. Sharp-edged, but there were some streamlined profiles. The Ford Taurus is a prime example. It was a complete turning point for the auto industry. I mean, when they announced the Ford Taurus and Chevrolet or General Motors saw it, they laughed. They didn't laugh for long, though, because the Taurus became the best-selling car in the nation. Yes, it actually outsold Honda Accord, Toyota Camry, and outsold everybody because it was unique, and Americans fell for it. Hatchbacks became really popular. And the biggest trend, I guess, of the 80s was front-wheel drive. I'll never forget when Chevrolet came out with it wasn't their first front-wheel drive entry because Olds Toronado and Buick Riviera for a long time had front-wheel drive. But this was the first, I guess, car for the masses, and it was called the Chevy Citation, and it was a true winner. Not. We had a lot of problems with torque steer back then. You know what that is? That's when you have the steering wheel turned and you give a front-wheel drive car gas and it wants to jerk the steering wheel out of your hand. That was a big problem. Americans hadn't figured that out yet. And so customers would buy the cars and then think that's something wrong with them, and they just weren't holding onto their steering wheel tight enough. But over time, the manufacturers learned it took going into the 90s to figure out pretty much how to eliminate torque steer. Okay, so let's talk about the 90s real quick. Rounded organic shapes, often described as jelly bean styling, integration of airbags into the steering wheels, analog brake system, and crash structures greatly influenced vehicle proportions. Clear lens headlights, this was something that was new in the 90s. And body-colored bumpers, they got away from bumpers. They didn't want you seeing the bumpers. They wanted them covered with plastic that wouldn't last and the paint wouldn't match. That was a problem in the 90s. It was also the time for the rise of the SUVs and minivans as dominant family vehicles. You know, notable cars of the 90s were the Toyota Camry, the Ford Explorer, the Dodge Caravan. You know, that was an interesting time. And again, that was a time where safety really started to become an issue. That's when they first started crash testing vehicles and reporting it frequently. They were crash testing vehicles for years before that, but this was when it became a marketing tool. Okay, I'll take my last break and I'll be back in just a second. Okay, we are up to the 2000s. You may remember that time. What was the trend? Retro. Yep, going back in time. Also bling and big grills. Yeah, we had the all-new VW Beetle, Ford came out with another Thunderbird. And guess what else got introduced? The Mini Cooper. Was it British? No. It was owned by BMW. What does BMW stand for, by the way? It is not British Motor Works, folks. It's Bavarian Motorwerken. So there you go. Oversized grills, chrome accents, and larger alloy wheels were a big trend. The emergence in the 2000s of smaller car-based SUVs. What did they call them? Crossovers. You'd think they would have come up with a better name than that. Interior tech grows. We started having the first nav screens, and they actually created a word, infotainment screens, and premium audio became a big deal in the 2000s. Chrysler 300, Hummer H2, Toyota Prius, really the first functional hybrid vehicle was the Prius. I thought it was a terrible design, but it was designed based on what they wanted it to do, get great fuel economy. So it was very aerodynamic. All right, where are we? Oh, yeah, the 2010s. So what were the design trends in 2010? Well, LED lights. That became a big deal. That's when your headlights got really expensive. Blackout, when people started really wanting to black out things like wheels, grills, things like that. And a much more tech-driven design. LED lighting allowed for aggressive front-end styling. You had floating roofs and hidden pillars and dramatic creases in the sides of cars. What's a floating roof? Well, that's where they paint the roof black. If a car's white, they paint the roof black. It looks like it's floating. And they have designed little creases that make it look like it was set down on the car. They call that a floating roof. Popularity of blackout trims, gloss black accents, the rise of EV-specific styling, which meant front ends without grills, which I despise that look, but very smooth underbodies. I mean, if you think about the notable cars, you can think cars like the Tesla Model S or the Kia Stinger, the Range Rover Evoque. These are some vehicles that were really trendsetters during that period of time. 2020s, I guess that's where we are. We're in the middle of it right now. EV minimalism and angular boldness. That's how they characterize this particular decade. So a clean sheet EV design, no grill, minimalist interiors, light bars, whatever this means, parametric surfaces, sharp lines, futuristic lighting, use of sustainable materials, recycled plastics, vegan leather, wiring that's made from soybeans that mice tend to really love to eat. We had one in the shop not too long ago that it destroyed the customer's wiring harnesses. That was very expensive. I think their homeowner's insurance paid for that. Two-tone roofs, oversized wheels, panoramic glass. Who knows what's coming down the pike for the 2030s? I hope I'm around to see it. Well, thanks for listening to this edition of My Car Guru. Hope you enjoyed the ride. If you have a question, call me 423-552-2020 or send me an email to LennyLawson2020 @gmail.com, and I'll see you next time.